Hello, I am Julie with Paisleys and Polka Dots, and in this video I am going to show you how I base coat some of our wood products. I have a bunch of pieces here that I've cut out, and I'm going to be showing you how I paint all of these and the techniques and tips I use to help me get through it all. So let's just dive right in. All of the kits do come with instructions, and this is what the instructions look like. I have suggested paint colors, but you can also just use colors of your choice however you want it painted, matching your decor or style. And then below I have steps for the process of how I put everything together. But if you're a little intimidated by all of this, then hopefully you'll find this video helpful as far as some of the tips and techniques that I do. So we're going to get started and dive right in. First, I'm going to assume that you don't really know anything about base coating or painting, so I'm going to start with the very basics. And some of the supplies that you're going to need are a water source. So you are going to want to have a bucket, a plastic bucket, a glass container, but I use what they call a wash basin. I have one back here that is well loved and well worn, filled with fresh water. And here it is, a little bit of a cleaner one here. And this is the paint bucket that I use. And the reason I like it is because it has two different openings here. And if you fill the water and keep it below this middle barrier here, then you can keep one side for clean water, and the other side you can use to clean your brushes, because you're going to want to keep your brushes clean. And these ridges down here in the bottom, actually you can rub your paintbrush along the ridges in the bottom of this bucket, and it will get your brushes super clean. And then on this side you can keep a clean water, so if you're doing a splatter or a highlight or a shading, then you have clean water to work with, because you don't want to muddy up your water when you're doing something like that. So also it works great as a brush holder, because you don't want to leave your brushes in the water. The paint will end up seeping up to the tops of the ends of the brush here. So you definitely want to keep your brushes clean after you get done painting, between coats and everything. Just don't set them down and let the paint dry in them. You're going to wash them out every single time you're done with the paintbrush, and then set it aside and make sure you get all the water out of it. Okay, so that's this is the bucket that I like for that. You're going to need something to put your paint on. You're going to need like a paper plate, and I'm going to show you how I use this. But I typically like what they call a paint palette, and this pad of paper you can buy at your Michael's or Hobby Lobby, and it has a sheen to the front of it, so that you can do your highlights or shading on this mat. You pour out a little puddle of paint on here, and this is typically what I like to use. I'm just going to go through the base coating techniques today, but this is what I would use for also the detail techniques, which I'm going to do that in a separate video. And it's great for blending out your paint. So this is typically what I like to use, because like I said, it has that sheen to it where it's nice for blending. So I'm going to set this aside for now. Next we are going to need, you need some paper towels, of course, to dry out your brushes once you get them clean. So I have some paper towels sitting here, and then we also need paint. The paint I use is the acrylic paints from my local Hobby Lobby or Michael's. I don't really have a favorite. I kind of like the Americana, the favorite, just because of the consistency of the paint. Folk art tends to be a little bit thicker and heavier, but I basically base my paint off of availability and color. So these will always give me better color options, and I just pick what matches my piece at that time. If I'm decoupaging paper on a piece, so if I'm putting paper on this one, then I usually typically take my paper to the store and I match a paint color that will work well with it. So these are the bottles of paint that I use. Also spray paint some of the pieces. If you're painting something solid, a big solid piece, spray painting works great. So if you're painting something like this, like our tiered tray, typically I assemble a piece like this completely finished, glue it all together, and then I spray paint it after I'm all done. And that makes it pretty easy to do when you have a big piece like this, other than the tiny pieces. But the tiny pieces, if you're painting different colors, say like the summer shapes, like these little summer shapes, then we're going to be using different colors. So then in this case, this is when we want to use the smaller acrylic paints. Also, sometimes you can't find the colors of spray paint that you want. So in that sense, then also the smaller bottles of acrylic paint work better for that purpose. The spray paint that I use is either, I like the Rust-Oleum brand or the Krylon brand. When you spray paint, you are going to want to let your coats of paint really dry well in between the various coats. Typically, I usually put on 2 to 3 coats of paint, especially on the sides of the wood where we have the laser burn. It tends to kind of soak up the paint and not cover real well. So typically, my sides of the wood will take sometimes 3 or 4 coats of paint, depending upon the color that I'm using, and then only about 2 coats on the top. So, but this is the paint I use. Also, sometimes I find that if I spray my pieces, my bare wood pieces, if I spray them first with a little bit of primer, then that also helps tend to have this paint cover a little bit better. I like the flat paint or the matte. I prefer flat best, but it doesn't come in very many colors. So I typically spray paint a lot of white, maybe red, just your basic colors. So that is the spray paint. I'm going to show you how to do this at the very end, and because I'm in my office, it's just going to be brief because you don't want to spray paint indoors. So I will go over that. Now for brushes. I have invested in a good set of brushes, and I've had these brushes around for many, many years. If I want to date myself, some of these have been back to the years I used to toll paint. Maybe some of you remember what that is. So these 2 brushes here are my go-to brushes. They are by Master's Touch and Royal and Langnickel, and they're 3/4 inch brushes, and they're considered a glaze or a wash brush, and these are my favorite. I also have a bigger one like this, and they're great for base coating. This is typically the size that I like. They are my go-to brushes. For getting into smaller things, if I want to paint inside like these stars right here, I'll grab something like this, or even something like this, something smaller to paint on in something like this. Okay, so I do use all different size brushes. These rounder brushes are great when you want to do detail work, and it has that little highlight, little swoosh highlight on it. That's what I use these for. These brushes here, these are angle brushes, and these are the types of brushes that I use to do shading and highlighting. So it's an angled brush to blend out your paint, and I'm going to show you that in a different video. So I'm going to set these brushes aside because I'm not going to be using them today. You can also just use the cheapy little foam brushes from your local hobby store. I don't particularly like these just because they I don't think they paint as nice, but I always say use what works for you. There's no right or wrong. Try out different techniques, try out different brushes that you might like. Another thing I like about having a nicer brush is the cheaper brushes tend to, when you're working with them and you're painting, the bristles want to separate, and I don't like when it does that because then my brush strokes aren't nice and even. So that also helps when you invest in a nice set of brushes. So why don't we just get started, dive right in and start some painting here. So when I paint, I like to paint the sides of my wood first. So let's say we have this block here. I'm going to put out some, want to shake up your paint, and I'm going to pour some into my paper plate here. And I'm going to use this brush. Now, when I first start painting, I want my brush to be moist, and this one is, but I usually put it in my water, and then I will dab it off on my paper towel, get all the water out of it, because you don't want any water in your brush, but you do want your bristles to be moist and all, nicely put together, just like this. Okay, and I find that probably the biggest problem that people have is getting too much paint on their brush. So I just dip into the side of the puddle of paint like this, and I don't have a lot of paint on my brush, maybe just like this, because if you start getting too much paint on your brush, then again that paint works up into the top of these bristles and everything's just going to separate. So you really don't need that much paint. And then I always paint the sides of my wood first. And this is our thickest piece of wood. This is 3/4 of an inch. And I always paint sideways, like so, and I got a little bit of dried paint in here. So if you get some dried paint on here, I just kind of pick it out with my bristles of my brush and then rub it on my palette or my paper plate, whatever I'm using at the moment. Okay, now when you paint, see how I have this ridge along the top edge here? You don't want that because you don't want it to dry like that. Otherwise, you're not going to have a smooth surface. So I'll take my brush at that point and I'll make sure, or I take my finger and wipe it off and then wipe it on my paper towel so that I don't have that heavy ridge there because it's going to dry like that and I don't want that to be that way. So typically I just go along the edge here, painting sideways. You can always go this way too. It doesn't matter. I just tend to think that I get less paint on the upper part of my wood if I paint sideways. Try different ways of painting also because everybody's hand is a little bit different. I have a pretty light hand. So again, see, I took off the paint that's on the top there. So, and then when you get all your sides done, once you go around your sides, I hold my piece in my hand and I paint the top. Now you want to paint going, you can make smaller strokes like this, but see how you can see the different stroke marks in there? So once you have that like that, then you're going to go back. You're going to make one long stroke all the way across. And this is going to even out your paint strokes. Just lightly brush it. Now, as the paint starts to dry, you don't want to keep going over it because then you'll start lifting the dried paint and then it will pull it up and make your brush strokes show more as well. So that's basically how I do it. Even a big piece like this. So you're going to go around the edges once again. And sometimes I will paint all of my edges first. Like if I'm doing all white, like I am now, I'll find all my white pieces and I'll do all the sides. See, once again, I have this up here, so I can just take my brush and get that off. So I'm going to brush around this whole piece really quickly here. So that way, if I paint all my sides first and then I let them sit and dry, then I can come back and I can hold the sides without lifting any paint off the side of the piece. So letting pieces dry in between kind of helps. But for this video, I'm just going to hold it. You can still hold it, and it tends to work that way too. So again, I'm going to make these long strokes in one direction. Like I said, you don't want to be going this way and then this way and then this way, you know, all over your piece. You want to start at the top, work your way down in long strokes. I said you can make smaller ones at first, but then make a long one. Make it nice and even. And as you do that, if you get anything on the side of the wood, make sure you clean it up. And when I get to the bottom, I went that way so that I don't get any paint on the bottom edge. But then again, I come back and I smooth it out. Get any paint I have off the side of the wood here. And I have a little bit of dried spot right here too. Let's get that off. Okay, there you go. So now I have two pieces painted. Now something like this, I'm kind of going to go against my rules here because when you have a piece like this, always in the instructions, I always say, don't get any paint inside this little slot because you're going to want to, I'm going to put my brush down here. Normally I would stick it in the water and wash it out. I won't let paint dry in my brush. So normally you are going to have, let me find my little house here, a piece like this that's going to fit inside of here. Okay, and if you get paint in here or paint along this edge here, your house may not fit together anymore. So if that happens, take a nail file like this and you're going to sand inside the slot, and that will remove any paint that you have and or sometimes due to weather conditions, this wood tends to swell a little bit. So you can also sand these side tab edges, and it will also help it to fit a little bit better. Another thing is the wood has a top and a bottom. If you notice, see this burn mark here? The burn marks are typically more at the top than the underneath side, and for some reason when the laser burns, it spreads as it burns through the wood. So the hole on the bottom side is not as wide as the hole on the top side. It's just the way they are. This one fits okay. But if you're having trouble with your piece fitting, also flip this over and try it. I always say to lay out all your pieces beforehand, kind of put them together, know how your piece is going to go together before you start painting or assembling, and that way you're going to know which side of the wood you want to paint. So that is a little tip there. Okay, so I'm going to go around the edge here again. Like I said, typically my edges will take at least 2 to 3 coats because of the burned edge. The top layers of my pieces, I usually don't do more than just 2 coats of paint. So as you can see, I have lots of little brush strokes that I've gone sideways, and then I'll make one long big stroke like that. And again, I'm going to get off the top. Okay, and I don't think I'm going to go all the way around this piece. Okay, so now when I get to the top part, I'm going to want to paint, I'm going to try and paint nice long strokes, but when I get to this, I'm going to cheat a little bit against my rules, and I'm going to go sideways like this and this way so that I don't get any paint in my slot. Okay, but once I get all of this painted, like so, then I'm going to again make a nice long stroke so that I can smooth out my paint and make it nice and neat. And see how I got a little bit right here, so I want to kind of get that out of there. Okay, and I'm going to turn my piece around. For some reason, I always find it easiest when I'm base coating to paint away from me. Now there are times where I paint toward me, but when I'm base coating, I always tend to paint away from me. But like I said, I try different ways, see what works for you. See, I just make these long strokes, kind of even out the brush lines. And again, I have a little bit of paint right in here, so I'm going to try and get that off. Just brush it ever so lightly. Okay, so I'm going to want to let my my paint dry in between coats, and then come back and put another coat on. And like I said, sometimes the sides of the wood needs more coats of paint. So I will set that one aside, and I'm going to wash out my brush here. The next technique I'm going to show you is using a roller brush. So if you don't like brush marks and you're having trouble using your paint brushes, this is a great little tip to use. I'm going to dry my brush here. So you want to get all the water out, and I'm going to set this aside. So this is your typical roller, a 4-inch roller foam sponge that I got from my local hardware store. And these you can use over and over again. It'll last you through your project. You don't need to wash it in between coats of paint. So I get everything painted the same color, and then I'll go and wash it out, and they'll last me for several uses. So they work great, and I'm going to show you how this works. You do need a little bit of a bigger puddle of paint because this technique works great for larger pieces like this little house I had here. And so you're going to want to have a little bit bigger of a puddle of paint to work with, because you need to get enough paint on your roller to go make your house covered. Okay, and like I said, you don't want to have paint on this bottom edge here, so you can take a piece of painter's tape and you can cover that bottom edge so that you don't get any paint on it. Now I'm going to make it just a little bit lower than the base, so that I know that no wood is going to be showing when I get all done. Okay, so you can put a little piece of tape on here, fold this back, and this way I'm not going to get any paint on it. Okay, so you're going to want to take your roller, roll it into the paint here, and load up your roller brush. like so. And you can even paint the sides of the wood like this. Okay, so you're going to pick it up like this, and I'm just barely touching the sides of the wood here with the roller, very lightly. Now I'll go back in and I'll use a smaller brush for that little spot right there. Okay, so I rolled that side. Now let's roll this side. Again, if you have puddles of paint or a lot of paint on the top edge or the bottom, with this roller, I'm just going to go right over the top, so it's just going to be quick. Let me move these out of the way just a little bit. Okay, so now for the top, make sure you have enough paint on your roller. Roll it in the paint really good. And this top section here is going to be covered with a roof. So I don't need to worry about this top section, but this bottom section is what we're going to want to paint. So just roll the paint onto your piece of wood. And I'm putting more pressure on this part than I did the sides. And it's going to take more paint, like I said, to get paint into your roller. So it uses up a little bit of paint in the beginning. Once you have your roller pretty set with a lot of paint, then it makes it easier. Okay, so here you go. See how quick and easy that was? Now sometimes if I have a lot of paint in my roller, it will leave these little bubbles. And if it does that, then when I'm all done with it, I'll just lightly roll the roller back over the top of the wood ever so lightly, and it will pull any of those little bubbles that I have out. So that's all there is to this roller. And I want to show you another piece, because another reason it's great is, let me set this aside to dry. And again, on rolling, I usually probably about 2 coats on this one, depending upon the color of paint, but I always typically tend to paint 2 colors. So this is another one good example why a roller works well, because when you're painting with a paintbrush and you're trying to go over these little teardrop shapes right here, paint really wants to get into those little holes, and you kind of gotta, dig it out with your paintbrush or your little bristles. So a roller brush works great for this, not getting it into the holes. Now you don't want to have tons of paint on your roller, because if you do, then it will seep into those little teardrop shapes. So again, I would normally paint the sides of this wood first, and then I would go back, load up my roller brush again, and then I would start painting the front of this. And because it's rolling over the top, it's not really going into those little teardrop shapes on my piece of wood. And I'm using a very light hand on this one. I don't have I'm not putting a lot of pressure, because I don't want paint to go into the little holes. So see how nice and even your paint works on this piece? There's no brush strokes to work with, or that you see, and it just comes out super, super nice. So that's another great way for using the foam brush, or the foam roller. Okay, so I'm going to set this aside, and the next thing I'm going to show you, let me take a drink here, because I feel like I'm getting a little hoarse here. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to work, and like I said, now that I'm done with this, I would go and wash this out, get all the paint out of it, and set it aside for, dry it all off, get all the water out of it with a towel or something, and then set it aside, and you can use it again. Okay, next we are going to, when you have smaller things, or again, you have trouble with paintbrushes and you just are frustrated with them, pieces like this work great for smaller pieces, because the roller is kind of a little big for painting something like this. So in that case, these little makeup sponges, these are awesome for painting a solid surface with holes in it like this. So I think the star is usually painted blue. So again, I'm going to put some paint out onto my plate here, or you can use your palette pad too. So I'll use my palette pad for this one. Okay, so put out a little bit of paint, and you're not going to want to dip in to the whole big puddle. I pull from the side of the little puddle just like I do my paintbrush. So there's not You can see there's not a lot of paint on there. And if you need to, you can blend it out a little bit. If you have too much paint on there, if you get too much paint on it. Again, I would paint the sides. I would probably use a brush, let's see, kind of like this one here. Let's get all the water out. Okay, and I would go around the edge like so. And for pieces like this, I like to use a smaller brush. And again, see how I'm painting away from me? I don't know why, but that's just what works for me. Get any paint off the top. And I keep turning it as I go. And I'm going to show you another little trick that you can do, but I typically like to hold my little pieces like this in my hands. It just works better for me, but there's another way that you can hold these in place for painting, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. Okay, so I got it all the way around my edges here, and again, I would put several coats on, not just the one. So let's wash my brush out, get the water out. Okay, so now what you're going to want to do is load up your brush or your sponge with some paint, and you're going to dab it right onto the top of this piece and these stars. Now you can paint inside the stars with a little brush like this, but typically by the time you get your whole piece done, they just add like a little bit of shadow to your piece. So I don't really even bother painting in the sides of that. Now something this big that's really going to show, I'll go in and I tend to paint the lines with a brush like this. Or you can even spray paint that if you have the right color spray paint. You can spray paint it and then it covers. But see how nicely that painted that with no brush marks whatsoever. And it works really, really well. You can even paint something larger. So like, say you have this piece and you want to paint this whole piece. Again, paint the sides and then come in, grab a little bit of paint from the side of your little puddle that you've made and start painting. Just dabbing it on. And I'll show you how quickly this goes. And I'm kind of just, there's really no, I just kind of start at the top and just keep blending my paint as I work toward the bottom. And I saw somebody do this. I actually can't take credit for it. I saw somebody else do it, how they painted, and I thought, wow, that's a really nice technique to use. So I tried it, and I actually love it, especially for pieces like this with the stars in it, so I don't get paint in there with my paintbrush. So there you go. And once I have 2 coats of paint on there, it's all nicely covered. So you can even paint the sides of the wood like that, and you probably won't if you have a lot of trouble getting too much paint on the sides of your wood. This works great. See, I don't even have any paint on the top. Okay, and if you're impatient like me, you can use your heat gun, an embossing tool. I haven't tried a blow dryer, but it will probably work too. And you can dry this. So say like you just have one color that you're working with and you're impatient waiting for your pieces to dry in between. This works great. Dries it super quick. So then I can go back and I can give it a second coat. And I'll just paint half of it so you can see what it looks like all covered up with 2 coats of paint. There you go. Let's dry it here. So there you have no brush marks on there. It's nice and clean, looks great. The sides, there's no paint stuck on all the sides. It just gives a nice clean look. So, and I use these over and over again. I wash them out, or if it dries, I just cut off the top and keep using it until it's all gone. So it works great for pieces like this one. This piece right here, I typically like to spray paint something like this because then I can get all the edges in here. But sometimes you don't have the right color paint that you want. So in that case, and I'm going to spray paint this one. So I'll just do it on the back side. So something like this, I'm going to use red because that's the color that this is painted. Put some out on the thing. And normally I wouldn't use the brush with the blue on the other side, but for this purpose I'm not going to get a new sponge. I'm just going to use the opposite side here. Okay, dip it into paint, and then again you can paint the top sides of your wood, or all the sides of your wood, not just the top. Okay, go along the edge like that. See, there's no paint on the top part right there like I get with my brushes. And then you can go back and you can paint this. Now I don't need to paint the center because there's that little circle that covers it. But I'm going to show you how fast this is to paint with a sponge versus a paintbrush. A paintbrush, this would take a really long time because you'd be getting paint in all of the cracks there. And with the sponge, you don't get that. As long as you don't use a lot of paint. If you use too much paint, you are going to get paint that just soaks down in there, and then you're going to have a problem getting it out. So just pull from your little puddle a little bit each time you need more paint, or each time you feel like your sponge is getting dry. Just pull from the corners of your puddle of paint. All right, see how quick that was? Again, several coats of paint. You're going to want several coats of paint on there. But super quick, super easy. That's all there is to that one. Okay, I'm going to set that one aside. I'm going to set my sponge here aside because we are done with that. The next technique I want to show you is a wash. Now, sometimes when we have etched pieces like this, you don't want to use heavy paint because then it seeps into all these etched cracks and it doesn't show as well. So you want to do what's called a wash. Now in this case, we're also going to break the rule a little bit because I say you don't want, when you're base coating, you don't want water in your brush. In this case, we are going to put some water in because a wash basically is watering down the paint. So I'm going to get my brush wet and I'm going to leave the water in the brush. Okay, and then I'm going to dip into the puddle and I'm going to pull out some paint onto my palette here and see how watery it is. Okay, now there's a lot of water still in my brush, so I'll usually dab this off on my paper towel to get some of the water out, and then I'll pull back into my puddle here. Okay, and again I paint the sides of my wood first. Now this is supposed to look like wood grain, so being really quick and fast works well for it because wood grain has variations in it. So you can paint heavier in some spots. You can go back over it a little bit. Sometimes I'll paint white first. Now see, I'm out of watered down paint. So you can just dip the very tip of your bristles into the paint again and pull out some more paint. Make some more. And again, if you have too much in it, you can dab it off on your paper towel. And then okay, and like I said, you can put some heavier little sections in here. All right, and I'm going to wash out my brush because this is all we're going to need for this. Dry it off. And I'm going to dry this so you can see what it looks like. There you go. So see how I have some variations of dark and light, but if you use a smooth wash and you do that one long stroke, then that's going to give you that smooth, even look if you want that. So on this one, and a lot of times on the instructions, I'll say once you're done base coating, to use a piece of sandpaper and distress your piece. That's always optional, especially on wood. You know, wood is a distressed item. So I use just regular sandpaper that I cut off of a large sheet. I like to use smaller pieces like this and fold them up. This is a 220 grit, it's the fine, and you're just going to take it and sand the edges of your piece of wood. You can sand the top a little bit too. Typically on these types of pieces, I'll show you how I sand that one. I'm kind of holding it at a little bit of an angle. I'm not, unless I want the top distressed. If you hold it flat, you are going to sand the top of your wood, versus if you just want to sand the sides of your wood, hold your sandpaper kind of at an angle just along the edge of your piece that you're working on. Okay, brush it off here. Okay, so that's the piece of wood. And you can still see, because we washed it, because we watered down our paint, it's not covering up all of our detail lines here. All right, so that is how you do a wash. For sanding something like this, I'll hold it in my hand again, and I just kind of brush the edges, go around. I don't worry too much about getting in here. I kind of just go over the top and wherever the sandpaper lands, but I am, like I said, holding it at an angle, if you can see. I'm not holding it flat against my whole piece. And you can, if you want to, say like you have your heavy brush strokes and you want to even those out, you can sand your whole piece and it's gonna even out your brush strokes. So like on a piece like this one's dry now. So say I have some heavy brush marks in here and I don't like the way it looks. You can take it and just sand your whole piece. And if you, white, typically if you like that distressed look, sometimes I'll only put one coat of paint on because I like this kind of washed, distressed look. But now my surface is really smooth again. So if I want to put another coat over the top to cover it better, then it'll make nicer brush strokes. Okay, so that's that. Okay, let's see what's next. Also, sponging works great for pieces like this. This one I think might be red. So let's get our sponge back here. And it's nice so that it doesn't cover up when you're trying to leave those lines there. So these etched lines are so that you can line up on your piece. This will line up on here. Not sure which way it goes right now. Like this. So you're going to line, that's what the etched lines are for on your piece of wood. Okay. So again, you can paint this super quickly, this whole big piece. Just like that. And like I said, on something like this, see how you're really going to see the dark lines. So I'll go in and I will paint. I don't know how well you can see this, how I'm doing it, but I go in and I paint. And I would do this first. I would paint the sides first. Get off any of the paint that I have on the top. And I'll go along the top, the sides of my wood. Get my little paintbrush in there. Like so. And paint these sides. And even if you need something really super small, then I have this brush that I can use. Okay, and I can get it in the little tiny holes up here. And see how I say red is pretty transparent? This is one of those colors that's really transparent. So you have to put a few more coats on. But as you can see, this line here, now it's painted red. So if you want those edges painted. Okay, so that's that. Now if you're painting something that actually has to have like these light bulbs. Now you're going to paint the top part of the light bulb black. Let's see, I'll paint it real quick, just one light bulb. And this is where I'm going to paint the top part of the light bulb black. So the string is black and the top part, and each light is going to be a different color. And I'm kind of moving quickly here just so we don't make the video way too long. But typically I tend to be a little bit cleaner and try to not have as much black paint right here. So, but I'm just going to paint right over the top of it with my color. So let's say we have a green light bulb. Pour out your little puddle of paint, and you can use, depending upon your piece, use a different size brush that would fit it. So I'll use this one, and my bristles are already moist because I had just washed out my brush. Of course, you're going to want to go around the outside edge first. And if I was to get any on the top, again, brush it off, or use your paintbrush and get it off. So with this one, let me see if I can hold it a little bit. I tend to lay it down, and this is where I paint toward me. So I'm going to want to have a little bit of a loop there. I don't want to go straight across, so you can, but I want a little bit of a loop. So I get a little bit of paint on my brush, just a little tiny bit, and I'm going to pull toward me and make a little bit of a loop with the edge of my bristles. And this is where a nice brush comes along, because see how tight my bristles are and how clean my brush is. So it goes on really super smooth to get those edges. And I didn't let the black dry, so it's kind of bleeding into that. But that's how, and painting towards you, you have more control. So when you're going to try and paint an edge that's also got another edge with it, like that. Okay. Or if you're painting, let me see, do I have anything else? Like if I want to paint around these little stars, I'm just going to go like this. Like that. Okay, so I'm always painting toward me because I tend to have more control if I bring the brush toward me instead of painting away. I don't have as much control painting away. So, and then on this one, I think the center of these stars are white. So if I was to do those, I would actually, where's my little brush? One of these tinier brushes. I'd wet it, get the water out, and then I would load up my brush, again, just the tip of the brush. And because it's going to be overlaid with this, I don't have to be too precise. I think it goes this way. Okay, so when I overlay that, but I'm not going to want to get it too far into the red either. So if I want to paint these, I'm just going to go in and I'm going to use my little brush. And like I said, I don't have to be too precise because the wood's going to go over the top of it. And I'm just going to paint this in, like so. Because the outside edges are still red. And I would paint several coats on that. So I'm just using a smaller brush. Okay, let's wash that out, put that aside. Okay, next I'm going to show you another technique. This makes life a little bit easier when you're painting those little pieces. So you can take a piece of painter's tape and you can fold it back like this, stick it onto your table or your workspace. I work from glass top tables. For the video, because there's so much glare, I use this white paper, but typically I just work on a glass top table. That way I can wipe it clean and not have any issues. So when you're painting something like this and they're super tiny, or like this little cup, now you can put these on here. If you're gonna, I typically paint my sides first, so I would get a little brush like this one, and I would paint the sides of my, I like to hold everything in my hands. I find I have better control. But you can also just put this down on the tape like this. You can put it down on the tape, and then you can leave it there and just paint the sides like this. And if you're going to go all the way around it, you can use put it on a paper plate so you can continue to move it around so you can get to the sides of your wood a little bit better. But then now that it's held in place, you can go back and you can paint the top without having it move on you. So let's paint this one. See how I'm getting paint in here? So that's where, like your little sponge, I can go with my sponge, especially these words. I can paint this with my sponge, and it takes me a whole few seconds to paint it. On the letters, I typically don't paint the sides of the letters because it gives a little bit of a shadow. You can paint the sides, but I typically don't, just because it's such a pain to get in all those little cracks and crevices. On occasion, I will spend the time and I will use a small brush like this to, now when you pick these up off the tape, because the tape is super sticky, you are going to want to be careful because these are delicate little pieces. But you can pick this up and you can paint the sides of the wood. I'm painting white now, so normally you wouldn't do this. Ignore the fact that I've got two colors going on here, but I think you might be able to see it better with the white paint. So I will grab my brush and paint the sides sometimes. Sometimes if I have a lot of light colors and I don't want that dark showing, that's when I might paint the sides. But typically this works great. So put it on there and get some paint on a sponge and dab it on. Super fast, super easy. Okay, so that's all there is to that, and it's great for any of your, like even holding pieces like this. If you want to hold them in place on your workspace, the tape works great. It also works great for when you're spray painting the smaller pieces. So I'll show you that when we get to that point. Next, I am going to show you how I splatter something. So I'm going to set this aside here, get this off our workspace. So I use a toothbrush, just an old toothbrush, and you are going to want to, I'm going to splatter this piece here. So what you're going to want to do is pour some paint out onto your, got some sanding stuff here. Put a puddle of paint out. Can you see that on there? Okay, let me move it up a little bit. Now this is where you're going to want to pull from your, see I have some muddy water back here. This one's a little dirty. This side over here is clean. So you're going to want to pull from that clean water. Get your, wet your paintbrush, or not, your toothbrush for that matter, and dip it into the paint. And kind of like the wash, you're going to make it really, really watery. Like so, and really get the paint, rub the paint into those bristles. So my toothbrush is pretty well loaded with watered down paint. Okay. Now I always test because I don't want a splatter that's really thick and heavy. It depends upon what you like. So I always get a little test sheet of paper. But if I was to splatter with it like this, when I've got it really loaded up, and you're just going to rub your finger along the bristles about 4 to 6 inches above your piece. So if I splatter like this, then I can get some like really heavy splatter going on, which I don't like. So I like my splattering to be light, and yes, your fingers get a mess. So I dab off some paint onto the paper towel, get it a little bit drier, and then I'll test it again. Make sure that it's what I like. And once I have it that way, then I'm going to go back in and I will splatter my piece. Like so. Okay, that's all there is to splattering. I'm just rubbing my finger, my thumb, along the bristles sideways. Okay, so I'm going to wash this out here. Usually my hands are full of paint by the time I get done painting a piece. It's a dirty job, right? Okay, let's put this aside. So that's all there is to splattering, and I think it gives a nice detail to the finished pieces. And again, you can sand the edge of this one so you can give it a little bit of distressing, like so. Okay, just like that. Now the next thing I'm going to want to show you, and I'm just going to show you on this piece, just because I don't have something that's detailed, or well, let's say we want to put a little piece of a highlight. You're going to want to use a brand new puddle of paint when you highlight something or dot something. Like say you have berries, little Christmas holly berries, or a center of a flower, and you want to put little highlight dots. I use this tool here. I think it's an embossing tool. I call it a dotter tool, and it has different size ends. So depending upon the dots that you want to make, you can even use the ends of a paintbrush. That works well too. So any sharp object will work, but you want to have a fresh puddle of paint to dip in. And this one's fresh, but I'm going to make another one anyway. Okay, so when you dot something, let's say it's my little light here, and I want a tiny little dot. I'm going to dip into the paint, and I'm just going to dot on my little light bulbs here. Now, if I wanted to make different size dots, then I would dip into my paint with my tool, or the end of my paintbrush, whatever sharp object you have, and then dot it and keep dotting until, so as you can see, then it's going to make different size dots as you work. So say like you have the center of a flower and you want to be pretty random. So dot it on there and keep dotting. So if I was to use a bigger, say like the end of a paintbrush, dip this one in. And as I keep dotting it, it's just going to get smaller and smaller. But let's say we're working with a Santa or another character, and you want your eyes to be exactly the same size. Well, then you're going to use the same tool. Let's dip into some black paint here. So that one's starting to dry. So I want a new puddle of paint over here. Okay, and I'm going to dip into the paint, kind of swirl my little tool around a little bit, and dot it on my piece of wood. Okay, and then I'm going to dip back into the paint, and this way my eyeballs are going to be the exact same size. Just like that. And I can also come back and I can put a little white highlight in there with a smaller. So if you want these eyes to be, let's say that when you first dot it, it's too big. So let's try a paintbrush, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So let's say we're going to dot Santa's eyeballs, and I thought, oh, that one's too big. So I want a little bit smaller than that. So what you can do is dot it on your palette pad first, and then dot it on your piece, and it's smaller. And then bring it back in, dot it on your palette again, and then dot the second one. So now they're the same size. So you can kind of determine what size you want based on how many times you dot it off onto your palette pad. All right. And typically when I make eyes, one of the biggest mistakes I think people make is they put the eyeballs too far apart. I like my eyes close together. But again, it's a matter of preference. However you like it, go with it. Everybody has their own creativity and their own style, and that's why we call it art, right? So my brush was sitting there. My bristles were, when you go to finish, I always keep my brushes upright in a container or a bucket. But my bristles, because I was sitting it here, were tending to separate like this. And you don't want to leave them like that because then it's going to dry that way. So if your brush looks like that, wet it, get all the water out, and then you can always put it on the side of your bucket for a holder, or put it in a container to keep your bristles nice and together. You don't want to leave them drying with the bristles separating because it'll stay. Okay, so I showed you. Okay, next I'm going to show you how to paint a bead. So these things can be rather tricky because, you know, they want to roll all over the place. So the way I paint a bead is, I'm going to use the green paint that we already have here. I paint the bottom, go around the bottom hole, like so. And then I take a paintbrush, one that'll fit inside the hole, put my bead on it, and then I continue to go around. Beads I typically put 2 coats of paint on. And again, if you're impatient and want this to dry real quick, which I like to paint one bead at a time and not have to set it down and wait, or have multiple paint brushes going with different beads on it. So I'll take my tool, dry it, keep moving it as you dry it. If you leave it in one spot too long on the beads, the paint tends to like bubble up a little bit. So, and then I can go back in because it's already dry. I can go back in and paint a second coat of paint. I have a friend who uses what do they call that? A pipe cleaner? The little fuzzy, yeah, I think it's a pipe cleaner, right? She puts them on those, the little pipe cleaners, and because it's got all the little fuzzies on it, it holds the ball in place from spinning. So, and then she just slides the bead onto it and paints them. So I thought that was a little clever technique too, so you can try that as well. Okay, so now I have 2 coats on. I'm going to wash out my brush over here. And we're going to dry this. Okay. See how my paint, I don't know if you can see that, it bubbled up a little bit right there. If it does, just kind of brush it out with your finger. Okay, so this is pretty dry. So I kind of work it off because it's still a little bit damp that if I really push my fingers into it, I'm going to leave fingerprints. So it's dry to the light touch. So I'm going to set that aside, but that's all there is to painting beads. So the last thing I'm going to show you is how to spray paint. And again, I do not do this in my office. You want a well-ventilated area to work with. I'm going to move all my stuff aside here. I'm going to do it quickly and just a little tiny bit so that I can show you how I spray paint. Because it works great for pieces like this, these big pieces that you want to kind of get into the sides and have it look really, really nice. Spray painting works great. It will work great for pieces like this as well. So something like this, when you spray paint, I'm going to move this one out of the way too. And I'm going to use this Rust-Oleum. Okay. And for this piece, because once you start spraying, if you spray this, the pressure of the force of the paint coming out will shoot this across your work surface. So you want to have a covered work surface, of course, and a well-ventilated area outside in your garage. When you spray paint, the weather will definitely affect it. So if it's really humid outside or moist, it definitely affects the outcome of how your paint dries. So again, you need to let your coats dry between the coats of paint. It makes a huge difference in your finished piece. So let me just push all these paints out of the way. I've already shaken this can. I'm going to shake it a little bit more just because it's been sitting here just a little bit. So you want to shake your paint really, really well. And a lot of people will take your paint and they just do one continuous spray, like all over the top of the wood. You don't want to do that. You want to make passes back and forth, letting up on the spray can as you go. I hold about 6 inches away. I can't hold it quite as far because of the video camera and stuff like that. So I hold it about 6 to 8 inches away from my piece, and I can spray at different angles to kind of get into, I typically spray around the outside edges first, because then it goes onto the top as well when I'm trying to spray paint the sides. So I paint the top last because it may not need as much paint because I've already gone around all the sides. So I'll show you this really fast. Like I said, do not spray paint in your house or office. You need a ventilated area. So this is what I do. So I can kind of come in on the sides like this and on the sides like this. And then I'll go back on the top and see how they're light, even strokes. So on the side of this, I'll go around the sides. This one I can kind of pick up. But if I have a work surface where I can walk around, then I kind of walk around it. And I'm going to go back and forth. Just like that. And less is more. Like if you do 4 coats of light paint, it's better than 1 heavy, because if you paint this too heavy and it's going to kind of puddle on there, and then it gets like this lemon peel effect, and you're not going to get a nice coat of paint. So definitely let it dry in between, put on light coats of paint, use a primer if you want it to cover a little bit better, but that's optional, you don't have to do that. But you can see how it kind of would get into these little corners, so, or in the little cracks, so that you're having color more consistent inside the piece rather than just when you sponge the top. So that's all there is to base coating. If you have any questions, you can put a comment below, or you can email me at info@paisleysandpolkadots.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I'm always available. So I hope you found this video helpful, and come back and watch our detail one on how to highlight and shade, and hopefully you'll find that just as easy. So thank you for watching. Bye-bye.